What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at the totally insane tiebreak game played between Javokhir Sindarov and Hikaru Nakamura in the tiebreak game of day number 4 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament. In this game, things get wacky even on move 2, and then in the middle game, Javokhir plays one of the craziest knight sacrifices you will ever see. You don't want to miss this game. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, of course, it is freestyle chess. The key factor here, the king is on e1, the major pieces are over on the king side, and the bishops are on a1 and b1, slicing down these long diagonals. That means moves like b3 and c4 will be very attractive. But of course, the strongest moves in this starting position include 1 c4, 1 f4, 1 knight g3, and 1 b3. In the game, Javokhir finds the strongest move 1 c4 in the spirit of the English opening, gaining space on the queen side. Now here, the strongest move for black is 1 c5, challenging white's pawn on c4. But instead, Hikaru, already on move 1, throws a big curveball. He goes for the move 1 g6. Now, what the heck is the idea behind this move? There's no bishop to fianchetto on g7. What is Hikaru doing? Honestly, I'm not sure. Now here, the computer says, shockingly, the strongest move for white is 2 c5. The idea being you clamp down on these squares b6 and d6 from that knight on c8. But instead, in the game, white goes for the equally shocking move g4. Gary the g-pawn enters the game. What is the idea behind this? I think it's designed to play against moves like h5 and f5, but overall, you're just being shockingly aggressive on the king side. All right, here, black continues c5, gaining space, and white does go knight g3, getting his knight developed behind that pawn on g4. And very interestingly, instead of that, the computer says queen g2 is the best move. The idea being that pawn on b7 is now pinned. You can't go b6, as then you would lose the bishop on a8. That is the idea. Instead, knight g3 chosen in the game by Javokhir Sindarov, and Hikaru, he decides it is time to fianchetto his queen. Queen to g7. The idea is very similar to queen to g2. That pawn on b2 is now pinned. If you go b3, for example, then you lose the bishop on a1 on the spot. So you cannot do that. With that in mind, in the game, Javokhir does go knight d3, developing his knight, and now Hikaru, he displays his aggressive intentions in this game. He goes b5, expanding on the queen side immediately. Hikaru is a madman in this game. You gotta love it. Now, what is the idea behind this move? Yes, you are giving up that pawn on b5 immediately. If white wants it, he can simply take that pawn and be up a free pawn as early as move 5. And that is what happens. C takes b5, chosen in the game. And what is the idea behind this move by Hikaru? Well, it's very simple. Hikaru, he has in mind the advance c4 in response, driving back that knight on the d3 square. That is the entire idea of this move. And now that knight on d3 has virtually no good squares to retreat to. All right, in the game, knight to c5 was chosen. Knight b4 would have been a little bit stronger, but either way, you got to get the knight out of the way of the attack of the pawn on c4. Now black continues, knight b6, developing his knight. Now we have bishop e4, clogging up this long diagonal and offering the bishop trade on the long diagonal. And here black says, no way, Jose. He goes d5, driving back that bishop immediately, and there's simply nothing white can do about it. That pawn is as steady as it gets on d5. Now here it turns out the right retreat for the bishop is actually bishop h1, retreating all the way back with the bishop. That way you are not in the way of your f-pawn. Instead, in the game, bishop f3 chosen, and this move makes some sense, but the problem is it clogs up the f-file and stops a future f4 advance, which decreases white's ability to fight for the center of the board. Now Hikaru, once again, he finds the strongest move here. It's absolutely shocking how good these grandmasters are at freestyle chess. He goes bishop e5, clogging up the long diagonal and pressuring the weak pawn on b2. And what is black going to do about it? How will he defend? Well, it turns out he's not going to defend at all. In the game, Javokhir, he goes queen to h3, developing his queen on the h-file. He wants to attack on the king side as soon as possible. Now, instead of this, the computer says the move e3 is actually the strongest. The idea being, honestly, I'm not sure. Perhaps you're freeing up e2 for the bishop, queen, or the king, and maybe you want to go d4 and so on. Maybe that move makes some sense, but overall, queen h3, to me, actually does look pretty logical despite not being favored by the engine. Now, here Hikaru, of course, he has the option of just going for it with the move bishop takes b2, but instead he decides it is time to castle on the king side, castle short. Short castles is the move. Now here, white, instead of castling, he goes king to f1, and this was not a mistake. Here he says his rook on g1 is perfectly placed, being behind that pawn on g4. Here, white wants to attack on the king side, therefore king to f1 is an artificial castling move, sliding his king over. But I do want to say, in this position, once again, the computer says e3 is the right continuation. Instead, king to f1 chosen in the game, and now here black goes queen to f6, getting his queen off that g7 square, unfianchettoing that queen for now. And what is the idea behind queen to f6? Well, we are about to find out. Here in the game, white goes knight f5, jumping up with his knight. And of course, with that queen on g7, the queen would be under attack. And now with or without the queen on g7, this pawn on g6, it can take the knight. However, that would be a very double-edged decision as of course, after g takes f5, you open up the discovered attack of the rook on the king, and it becomes very difficult to block that check. Now, what else could black do in this position? Well, it turns out the threats, including knight to h6, are so severe, black has almost no choice but to take the knight. So, g takes f5 chosen in the game. That is the strongest move here. White, of course, takes back the pawn with check, opening up the attack of the rook on g1 against the king on the g8 square. Now, black, the only way to survive here is to block the attack with the knight, knight g6. If you don't do that, you have to give up your queen or perhaps your bishop to defend against the check, but that is not recommended at all. Instead, knight g6, returning the piece immediately, is the only way forward. Now here, white takes on g6, f takes g6 is the move. Black takes back, and then we have d4, gaining space in the center of the board, driving back that bishop. And yes, you can take the pawn en passant, even in freestyle chess, but that would not be very strong. White could take back with the knight, hitting the bishop, defending the pawn on b2, and so on, and white would have an excellent game. Instead here, black simply takes the seemingly free pawn, bishop takes d4 chosen in the game, and it also attacks the knight on c5. And now where is the knight going to go? I mean, almost every square here is being covered by the black pieces. The only good square, I mean, really is like a6, even a4 is covered by the knight. So what is white going to do about this knight on c5? This is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the absolutely stunning move played by white, played by Javokhir Sindarov in this position. This move is a true shocker. It's a very deep move. All right, here in this position, Javokhir goes for the move knight to e6, the absolutely brilliant knight sacrifice. What is the idea behind this move? It's very, very simple. First of all, you are forking the rooks on f8 and d8. That means if black does not take the knight, he's going to be in significant trouble. However, both of the moves to capture the knight, f takes e6 and queen takes, also have their problems. Let's go through them one by one. If you take with the f pawn, f takes e6, then after queen to h6, you threaten rook g6, forking the queen and the king. That would be absolutely deadly. And the point of knight to e6, you cannot go rook d6, defending g6, as the e pawn blocks the rook. That is the entire idea of that sacrifice. But after knight e6, if you take with the queen, you also run into trouble. Here, you just go queen takes, f takes, and then rook takes d6. And with the queen no longer on that f6 square, the bishop on d4 hangs. So for that reason here, Hikaru, he does not take the knight with the pawn or the queen. Instead, bishop e5 is chosen. He retreats the bishop out of the attack of the knight and the rook, but giving up an exchange in the process. But that turns out to be the right way forward. Now, white takes on f8, black takes back, rook takes f8, and here white is technically up the exchange. He has the extra rook versus the extra knight of black. However, black has those very strong pawns in the center of the board, and that does give him enough compensation in this position. All right, white continues, queen to h6, flying up with the queen, a very aggressive move. Black goes bishop f4, putting pressure on the queen on h6 in return. Now we have queen to h5 for white, sort of a cheeky idea. Of course, the pawn on g6 is still pinned to the king on the g8 square. You cannot take it. Black goes king g7. The king is still under the pin. However, you are setting up rook to h8 ideas, hitting the queen on h5, and that would be very good for black. Now here, white goes b3, another cheeky idea by the first player. The point being, now the queen is pinned to the king on the long diagonal, and if you don't react immediately, you will lose the queen. Of course, black has some ideas, including d4 and e5, to try and keep that queen alive, but what's it going to be? Well, he doesn't do either of those moves. Instead, c3 is the move. The point being, now black has a very strong pass pawn on the queen side on that c file. It's going to be very hard to stop that pawn. All right, here, the strongest move for white, it turns out, is simply e3, driving back that bishop and opening up these light squares for the bishop or the queen. Instead, though, in the game, rook to g4 was chosen. This move looks very active. You're activating the rook on the 4th rank, pressuring the bishop, and so on. But here, black, he's not in any trouble. The bishop, of course, is defended by the queen, and therefore black here simply goes d4, a very strong move, supporting the pawn on c3 and further increasing the strength of this blockade on the long diagonal. That blockade is so important for keeping the queen and the king alive in this game. And Hikaru, with his incredibly strong pawns on c3, on d4, despite being down the entire exchange, despite being down the rook for the extra knight, he is just completely dominating here. All right, in this position, white decides it is time to trade those bishops. This diagonal was opened up by that move, d4, and here white trades on a8. Bishop takes a8 is the move, then rook takes a8, and then we have queen to h4, sliding back with the queen and pressuring the queen on the f6 square. Now here, the simplest solution for white, or for black, sorry, for Hikaru, is just queen takes h4, trading queens immediately and entering into a winning endgame. Instead, Hikaru goes for the slightly more complicated option, c2, the intermediate move, putting immediate pressure on the rook on d1. Now, of course, white has the option of trading on f6, but if you do that, then the rook on d1 is under attack, and black controls the queening square, meaning d1 defending will not work in the future. No matter what white does, he is in trouble. Here, white goes rook to e1, perhaps the only good retreat square for that rook. Everywhere else besides d3, it would get knocked off, and on d3, you do nothing to stop c1, promoting to a queen. Now here, Hikaru, he does trade queens. Queen takes, rook takes. Then we have c1, promoting to a queen. Of course, white has no choice but to give up the rook for the queen. So, rook takes c1, then bishop takes c1, and here the strongest move for white is bishop takes d4, hitting the king with check, with tempo, activating your bishop, but instead rook takes d4 chosen in the game, setting up all kinds of nasty discovered attacks. For example, rook d1, hitting the king with check with the bishop, and then picking up the bishop on c1 is a very real threat. With that in mind, Hikaru, bishop g5 is the move, getting the bishop out of attack, and now white here has no good discovered attacks. If you go rook d8, that looks scary, but of course the rook on a8 is being defended by the knight, and therefore Hikaru has nothing to worry about. And here in this position, let's do inventory real fast. In this position, Hikaru, he still has the extra knight. However, white only has 2 pawns in return, and that means Hikaru is up a piece for 2 pawns. That is a massive advantage in this kind of endgame where the pawns are not a threat yet. All right, here, rook d6 is the move. We have the discovered attack on the king on g7. The king's got to move, or we got to block the check somehow, some way. In the game, king to f8 was chosen, retreating the king back to the back rank. Then we have rook c6, sliding the rook over, bishop f4, a4, gaining space, bishop takes h2, then a5, further driving back that knight. Here, Javokhir Sindarov knows the only chance you have is to advance those queenside pawns as quickly as you can. That is your only chance at playing while being down an entire piece. But of course, Hikaru, he is a very good endgame player. He has everything under control. He goes knight d5, centralizing his knight. Then we have bishop d4, jumping up with the bishop. Then rook b8, putting pressure on the pawn on b5. How is white going to respond? Well, he gobbles up the free pawn on a7, bishop takes a7, hitting the rook with tempo, but of course, giving up that pawn on b5 in the process. Now we have a6, advancing the pawn on the queen side, and here black makes a critical mistake. The best way to fight for the win is knight to c7, retreating the knight. It is defended by the bishop on h2, and of course, it puts pressure on that pawn on a6. Instead, in the game, rook to a5 chosen, and one of the weaknesses of this move, it does release the pressure on that pawn on b3. Here, white goes bishop d4, a very precise move, freeing the way to advance the pawn to a7, potentially to a8. And here Hikaru makes a devastating mistake. He goes for the move e5. Now, what is the problem with this move? It's very, very simple. White's going to go bishop c5, gaining a tempo on the king, and he's actually going to have winning chances here. So instead of this move, in this position, king to e8 immediately is the right move. Then you go e5 later when white cannot go bishop c5 with a gain of tempo on the king. Instead, e5 played immediately, and this move leads to massive problems for Hikaru. White goes bishop c5, hitting the king. Black goes king e8, and now a7, the pawn on the queen side. It has become a major asset. It's threatening to promote. White is threatening rook c8, and then a8, promoting to a queen, winning the rook after rook takes. And what can Hikaru do to slow down the attack? It turns out nothing good. Here, black goes e4, and in this position, Hikaru, after playing e4, he immediately resigns on the spot to Javokhir Sindarov. Here's why. White is just going to go rook c8, and if king d7, a8, forcing rook takes, and then white is up the exchange in the endgame for zero compensation for black. And Hikaru must resign after his mistake. Even if you go king d7 here, trying to guard c8, then you just go rook to d6. And after the king moves anywhere, you take the knight. And once again, you are up massive material. You have these pawns on the queen side. You are just completely winning. And for that reason, Hikaru, no matter what he does, he is lost. And therefore here, he resigned on the spot to the tremendous player, Javokhir Sindarov. This guy came out of nowhere in this tournament. Wow, very impressive game. Comment down below what you thought of this game so far. Smash that like button, show me some love, and we'll dive right into the next game here. All right, Chess YouTube, that is it for this video. I continued going in my main video covering all of the best games from day 4 of this tournament, but in this video, we're just covering that one game. If you want to see the entire video where I cover all 4 games, all 4 of the best games from the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tournament day number 4, check out this video right here. I cover all the best games from day number 4 of this tournament. So check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.